So before you ever create your documentary, you should determine the style of the film. There's many different types of documentary styles, and we're going to talk about all of that right now. Sometimes it can feel like you're restricting yourself by picking one style, but what that does is when you create boundaries around your work, it helps you head in one direction. It helps you to not be aimless, as we spoke about. You don't want to be an aimless filmmaker. You want to be an assertive filmmaker. So choosing one style helps you get going in that direction. It helps you to know how to approach all your scenes, how to approach your pre-production, what cameras you should be using, gives you a guidance. And now you can mix and match styles, but I really think it's worthwhile knowing what kind of film you're making before you ever start off. So the first documentary style, and this is a classic style, it's kind of how documentary got started, is verite. It means truthful cinema. It's letting everything around you unfold in front of the camera. It's where you do the least amount of direction as a director. You're capturing what's happening rather than trying to shape what's happening. I really like this documentary style. I like using this for scenes within my films. I think verite, you can go completely pure verite style filmmaking where you just never direct anything. You just let it all happen in front of you. A film like Hale County this morning, this evening, really just lets everything happen in front of the camera. Now, the powerful things with verite is that people can't argue with what happened on camera. They can't argue with what you've shown. It's just unfolded. It's a very pure way of approaching documentary. Another film that did this that was really great was Overnighters. It's one of my favorite documentaries of all time. So often the filmmaker just stood back and allowed the craziness that was happening in this one man's life unfold in front of him. It was about the oil fields, I think in North Dakota, where there was this influx of people coming to the town to try and make a living. And it shows this pastor's battle between his churchgoers and the people who are coming in as he's trying to help everyone who's arriving in his town. And maybe that might sound boring to you, but trust me, this is one of my favorite documentaries of all time. And I think one of the better documentaries out there that approaches in a verite style of filmmaking. Now, verite requires a great deal of time investment. You need to be ready to spend a lot of time with your characters because not every scene is going to work out. But when you spend a lot of time with your people, with your character, you'll get some amazing moments along the way. My creative partner, Michael Del Monte, just finished a film called His Name is Ray, which hasn't been released yet, but this is a pure verite style of film. Very, very powerful film. It's about a man on the streets who is trying to change his life, who's trying to get off his addiction to drugs. An incredible film. Again, Michael had to spend 8 months straight filming this man's life in order to be able to create a 90-minute film that was interesting and compelling. Verite takes time. The next style of documentary is reenactment or docudrama. Now, this is where you recreate what happened in the past. And this can be very powerful because you can really cinematically capture what had happened. Now, this isn't a typical dramatic film. This still has documentary interviews and still allows for documentary moments to happen, but it also takes the past and recreates it. Great films like this are Wormwood. That was a doc series done by one of the masters of docudrama, Errol Morris. Highly recommend you check out his work. He had another film, The Thin Blue Line, that recreates all the moments. There's these old TV shows that are always about like plane crashes and stuff, and they get really corny at times because you have an interview and then really poorly shot footage. An interview, really poorly shot footage. But what's great about filmmaking right now is the camera gear is so accessible that you can create really amazing cinematic scenes that recreate what happened in that person's life. Another great series that does this is McMillions. What they did that was interesting is rather than showing everyone's face, they got really creative on how to blur out the reenactment. So it wasn't just these random shots of close-ups of people's hands, but they used a lot of wide shots. They made it very cinematic, and it drew you into the story as you had these real-life documentary interviews recanting what happened in their life. And as they're saying that, you're seeing these cinematic sequences unfold. The next style of documentary is talking head, and this is essentially where your documentary is driven by interviews. And you'll have interview and a little bit of B-roll. You'll go back to the interview, a little bit of B-roll. There isn't many verite style scenes. There isn't things unfolding in front of the camera. It's usually people retelling an event, retelling what happened. And instead of you having reenactments, you're using B-roll. One of my favorite talking head documentaries is called Fire. It's about the fire festival that happened. It's kind of like a disaster film. You get a lot of talking head interviews. Now, there is some moments where they actually have the B-roll of what occurred. So there is some kind of verite moments. But for the most part, I would call this a talking head film because it's people talking about something that happened. Another great film that you should see of this is The Corporation. It's talking about kind of how, corporations are evil, but lots of amazing talking head interviews. And the film actually holds your attention for the whole way. Now, talking head documentaries need lots and lots of research because you're usually only going to get 1, maybe 2 times to sit down with the person you're interviewing because you're going to have so many interviews to conduct. So get a researcher on board if you're going to do this style of film, or really have mapped out what you want each interview to say in the film. You really kind of have to know your whole film before you ever go out on a talking head, because the problem with not knowing your film's storyline or your story arc, which we'll talk about in this documentary course, but without knowing that ahead of time, you're going to be aimless. Again, you don't want to be an aimless filmmaker. You want to be an assertive filmmaker. You're going to be aimless with the questions you ask. So if you want to do a talking head documentary, you really need to research and plan out your film ahead of time. The next style of documentary is expository. And this is where you're trying to persuade your audience or retell an event. One of the most famous filmmakers for this is Ken Burns. He does an incredible job of retelling historical events. And that's where we get that term, the Ken Burns effect, where you slowly zoom in on an image. And these documentaries usually have a narrator to guide the whole film along. And what's great about having a narrator is you have control of the story, you have control of the pacing, and you can also go into areas of the film that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do with a verite or talking head, because you're going to be able to say exactly what you want to say. Now, with expository style documentaries, if you're investigating a controversial issue, the difficulty is that your voice can overtake the film and it can feel like a biased film. If you're a filmmaker, you want to make sure you're creating an unbiased film, or at least that you're approaching it in that manner, because if you approach it too biased, you're only going to preach to the choir, as in you're only going to reach the converted, as we say, the people who already believe in your topic, or the people who you're trying to convince are going to taste that bias. They're going to feel that coming through your edit, and they're going to turn off your film. They're not going to be convinced with what you're saying is truthful. So what's cool though with expositories, you don't always have to go after controversial issues whatsoever. You can be a historian. You can look at like The Art of Baseball, like Ken Burns has. He's a great example of people who approach their filmmaking this way. So simply with expository, it's to retell an event or to persuade people on an issue. The next style of filmmaking is performative or participatory. But the performative style documentary is where the filmmaker is part of the film. And the most famous person for this is Michael Moore. You look at any one of his films and he's participating in the creation of the film. And this is where the filmmaker is journeying to find out something, to discover a truth, or to pursue a story. One of my favorite films of all time that does this is Finding Vivian Maier, where the filmmaker, the director, put himself in the film and he's pursuing something. Now, what's great, if you're going to do this, if you're going to put yourself in the film, you should be wanting something. Like we've always spoke about, you don't have a character unless they want something. So what is it that you want? Because if you're going to be part of the film, you need to be an interesting character. And we've already explained what interesting characters are. So determine if your voice is going to be important to the film before you put yourself in the film. Zac Efron just did this with a documentary series, Down to Earth. It's on Netflix now. He's put himself in that series. It's where you're getting to journey with someone who's trying to discover a truth or pursue something in their life. It's where you're participating as the audience in the creation of the film. You're acknowledging that this is a documentary. You sometimes see the cameras. You're very aware that the film is being made, but you're going after a goal. The next style is reflexive documentary. And this is pretty much what most YouTubers are making when they go do a travel video. The purpose of the film is the creation of the film. It's watching someone react. That's why it says reflexive. They're reacting to the world around them, and their whole film is about the film being made. It's, hey, I want to go travel here. Why don't you come with me to make this film? And so the tension in those films usually just becomes like creating the film, and they can become a bit aimless. And this is why a lot of travel videos and a lot of new filmmakers make this style of film, because it is easy to make in the sense that You don't necessarily approach it with a story. It's just about creating the film. But the problem about this is after a while, they can get boring. You need to have a purpose. You need to have a goal in mind. Now, they are fun to make for you as a filmmaker, and they're sometimes a great place to start because the film is just about you making the film. But it's good to have a goal in mind when creating a reflexive documentary. A great film that does this is The Long Way Round. It was actually a doc series. It was shot by Ewan McGregor, and I forget his partner's name, but it was about their journey on motorbikes. And so the film is actually about the idea of making this film about this journey. So this is a great idea. When you have a goal, when there is a journey, when there's a destination, it makes the film more compelling, more engaging. We want to keep watching because we want to know if the filmmaker is actually achieving what they set out to do. One of the last styles we'll talk about, and this is where I kind of started in my career. I still really love this style, but I would say I'm kind of maturing past it, but it would be the impressionistic style of documentary. This is a non-traditional approach to documentary. It's where the cinematic approach is often one of the leading characteristics of the film. You're really embracing a stylistic storytelling way of approaching your film. So a piece that I made like Beauty and the Battle, I would say this is kind of impressionistic where we recreated scenes in Deli Carr's life, but then also filmed a real event unfolding where he was trying to take the best picture of his entire career after he just had a stroke. You know, a couple months before this, he couldn't even pick up a camera. So we approached the film where we recreated some scenes from his rehab, but then we also created these beautiful, artistic, very, as I say, impressionistic, which you shouldn't use the name of a word when you're trying to describe it in the definition. But I love impressionistic because you get to create these very cinematic, symbolic sequences that represent what's going on in the person's life. This is where you really get to direct and be a part of the creation of the scenes, where you get to put your artistic voice into the film. Now, too much impressionistic filmmaking can leave people feeling like they didn't necessarily watch a documentary. They just saw someone showcasing their artistic liberty. But you do find more documentaries in the short documentary category approaching their filmmaking this way because it is cinematic. And when I say cinematic, I mean it transports you to another world. You get to create these beautiful images in association with the story that you're telling. A short documentary you could watch right now, you could just Google it, called The Bale Project. I would call this an impressionistic style documentary. It's very powerful, really liked it. And Beauty and the Battle, you can go look at that on my Vimeo as well. The last documentary style I'm going to talk about is experimental. And there really isn't any rules for experimental. This is kind of do what you want. Andy Warhol is kind of the godfather, the king of this style of filmmaking, where you get to take a ton of artistic liberty. It's avant-garde cinema. Now, experimental isn't necessarily my favorite style. I enjoy it for maybe a 5 to 10 minute documentary, but making an audience sit through 90 minutes of experimental filmmaking can get patronizing at times because it's difficult to understand a story. It really leaves the story up for interpretation at times. But one way to make a powerful experimental film is to determine a very strong theme. So your audience can at least be associating the scenes that they're watching unfold on camera with the theme that you were talking about. And remember, the theme is what we are saying, what you want people to learn. It's the heartbeat of your film. So a film like Koyaanisqatsi, very experimental, but there is a theme. They even put it in the title. They said life out of balance. So we're watching a series of scenes that are showing the chaos that was occurring on the planet. It's a very, in some ways, prophetic film in that way, showing the chaos and the direction that humanity was moving. So quickly, just to recap those guys, you have verite filmmaking, which is truthful cinema. It's letting life unfold in front of the camera. You have reenactment or docudrama. This is where you go back and recreate scenes that had occurred in someone's life or in a story or an event that actually occurred. You're recreating, reshooting what happened. Talking head documentaries, this is what I'm doing right now. It's where you have people sometimes looking directly into the camera or just off to the camera to a director, and they talk about something that's happened, and then you use B-roll to help retell that story. Next is expository. This is when you're trying to retell an event or persuade people on a certain issue. Next is the participatory or performative. This is where the filmmaker's involved in the making of the film. He's pursuing something, he or she, sorry, is pursuing a story, an idea, and the film is following them. And reflexive documentary, this is about reacting to the world around you. This is about you making the film. The documentary is actually just about the film being made. Impressionistic, as I mentioned, one of my favorite styles because it allows for a lot of artistic liberty. This is where you really embrace a stylistic storytelling style. There's less rules around impressionistic. It allows you to recreate scenes. It allows you to have verite moments. You get to kind of have a bit more creative freedom. And the last, which is just complete creative freedom, there isn't really any guides for this, is experimental. Again, like I said, this is fun for moments. It's difficult to pull off an experimental film that remains engaging for 90 minutes, but you can definitely have experimental sequences throughout even a verite style film. And which is what I want to say is you can mix and match these styles as much as you want, but it's good to do research on them. I'll put a document as part of this course that lists different films that would be in these different categories. So you can go watch them on your own time and really start to explore the different styles and the different kind of films in each one of these categories.